Hello, my wonderful members and people listening from the podcast. Let's continue, shall we, with Mary's story. Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire Witch, from the hand of Miss Blythe. As a precursor to the poisoning for which Mary Bateman was eventually to be tried and hanged, the Mrs. Kitchen, two unmarried Quaker sisters who ran a small draper's shop with the mother near St. Peter's Square in Leeds, certainly had cause to rue their acquaintance with Mary. St. Peter's Square fell within the Quarry Hill district of Leeds. In Georgian times, a fashionable and genteel spa area where people came to take the benefit of the waters. From the 17th century, the northern spa resorts of Harrogate, Ilkley, and the area around Croft-on-Tees were better known for offering a variety of hydro and other therapies, usually rather high-class affairs, with residential accommodation. Leeds also began to exploit its own spas, owing to the sulphuric waters bubbling up from the underlying geology. But although the waters from St. Peter's Well were said to ward off rheumatism and rickets, the sulphuric waters were also a contributory factor in the development of Leeds' tanning and dyeing industries. After ingratiating herself into the Kitchen sisters, Mary sometimes worked in their shop, becoming a confidant of theirs. As many had done before, and would continue to do, the ladies fell for Mary's special brand of mysticism in predicting their futures. Although we cannot say to what extent the Kitchen sisters were staunch Quakers, it may be testament to Mary's powers of persuasion what kind of duped them at it all. Since white magic, no less than black, was condemned by members of the Society of Friends, some early Quakers were particularly vocal against the practices of cunning folk, perhaps because they themselves were accused by their critics of using sorcery to attract new members to their faith, and so wanted to distance themselves from the practices. Indeed, the final line of the Extraordinary Life sermonizes that those who trust in diviners shall be confounded and perish. Perhaps, however, the Kitchen sisters were more amenable to prophecies passed on from a third party, as Mary's predictions now came from the successor of Mrs. Moore, the equally fictitious Miss Blythe, whom Mary, as a mouthpiece, confidently asserted had the power to divine destinies. Why Mary decided to switch alter egos at this particular point is a mystery, though Miss Blythe, who apparently lived in Scarborough, was a true, proficient, and able to read the stars. Scarborough had been an important medieval stronghold, its castle ruins still domain the skyline, but the acidic waters discovered by Elizabeth Farrow in 1626 had led to the place becoming a spa town. By 1735 it had a new fangled bathing machines that could be rolled down the beach to the water's edge. Its elevation to spa town gave Scarborough a new gentility, which may well have impressed the Mrs. Kitchen. In early September 1803, one of the sisters fell ill. Whether her sickness was genuine or induced by Mary, we can only guess, and Mary, is fine concern, took upon herself the task of nursing her. Mary also had the kindness of heart to get medicines for a patient, apparently obtained directly from the hand of Miss Blythe, and personally prepared and administered these powders. Within a week, Miss Kitchen was dead. On hearing of her daughter's precarious health, the girl's mother had hurried to Leeds from Wakefield to be by her side, and though Mrs. Kitchen had been in perfect health when she embarked on her journey, within days of her arrival, both mother and the surviving daughter appeared to be stricken with the symptoms of the fatal illness. Just 10 days after the first Miss Kitchen had taken a turn for the worse, all three of the women were dead, and at the time the cause of death was attributed to cholera morbus, a disease that was not yet fully understood and which would not hit Britain as a pandemic until 1831. Pertinent to Mary's methods before the development of analytical chemistry, increasing the risk that a poisoner would be caught. Poison was a popular method of murder, a modus operandi frequently employed by females, requiring no physical exertion. The lady of the house was also ideally placed to conveniently administer a poison, as they were predominantly involved with the preparation of food and the management of and access to household remedies and medicines. In Mary's case, the administration of the poison which killed the first kitchen sister was rendered all the more convenient, as she dosed her under the confident belief that a remedy was being given. It would seem from the symptoms of the victims that Mary was indeed using arsenic. From the close of the 18th century, arsenic pervaded almost every aspect of everyday life in Britain, and the poison left a hefty toll of death and debilitation as a byproduct of an emerging smelting industry. It was cheap. It was readily available as a rat killer by the early 1800s, though it later became the poison of choice in Victorian melodrama and the popular press. A significant proportion of the fatalities caused by arsenic were more pedestrian, resulting from accidental use in food. Arsenic was virtually odourless and tasteless, easily confused with flour or sugar and other cooking essentials. Two cases long after Mary Bateman highlight the problem. In November of 1858, the Bradford humbug poisoning had resulted in the accidental arsenic poisoning of more than 200 people, when sweets inadvertently made with arsenic were sold from a market stall. A pharmacist's assistant had accidentally sold arsenic trioxide in place of the harmless calcium sulfate, and a terrible result spoke for itself. A further mass poisoning, and this time of 6,000 people, occurred in Manchester, 1900. 70 people died from drinking local beer. Arsenic in the glucose used for brewing was present in levels that meant anyone drinking 5 pints of the brew would be ingesting a dangerously high dose. And with many men drinking this amount of beer every working day, the death toll is less than surprising, it being actually 6,000. Exposure to arsenical compounds in consumer goods such as fabric dye and wallpapers was also commonplace, especially for those who manufactured these products, and in the polluted air. Arsenic was even used in medical proportions to treat everything from asthma and cancer to reduced libido and skin problems. Yet William Farr, the statistic head of the General Register Office, was to comment in 1840 that it is generally asked for to kill rats, but it is questionable whether arsenic kills more rats than human beings. In France, arsenic came to be called something like poudre de succession, inheritance powder, and with a cumulative effect, acting particularly on the liver and kidneys. It could be administered in small doses over a span of time until the critical level was reached, meaning that the poisoner could be comfortably far away when death occurred. In Mary's day, the relatively inexpensive arsenic was readily available in a white oxide powder, a form derived from the metallic ore, the fatal dose known to be an amount equivalent to the size of a pea. Once administered, the poison induced symptoms of irritation, burning to the throat, faintness, nausea and vomiting mucus flecked with blood, progressive abdominal pain, a respiratory constriction, and white, furry covering to the tongue, a signal that within the next 12 to 18 hours, severe diarrhea and a weakened irregular pulse would cause collapse and result in death. The victim conscious until the end. Enlightened doctors familiar with the cholera symptoms occasionally seen in Mary's day attributed murder to disease. Eventually, because of the number of murder cases involving the poison, the government was forced to introduce in 1851 the Arsenic Act, forbidding the sale of any arsenic compounds to a purchaser who was unknown to the supplying pharmacist. Poison bottles were given distinctive features. Coloured glasses like cobalt blue, inky black and dark green ensured they were easily recognisable, as well as having raised lettering or inlays of the words poison or death on the glass, especially useful if you were fumbling by candlelight. Patterns included lattice work, deep grooves as well, geometric shapes. These were another. The skull and crossbones, obviously, which would have been particularly useful in instances where the consumer was illiterate. Would-be poisoners, however, were further thwarted by the introduction of a requirement that all manufacturers of arsenic powder mix 1 ounce of a colouring agent, indigo or soot, were employed to every pound of arsenic powder produced. But all that lay in the future. Mary and many of her contemporaries could buy arsenic with relative ease. In light of Mary's vocation as a career poisoner, contextualising her crimes, several cases of note, also hailing from Yorkshire, warrant examination. Hannah Whitley used a pie as the delivery medium for a fatal dose of arsenic, with the poison concentrated in the crust. Hannah claimed she had been coerced into the act of poisoning by her employer, a local linen weaver named Horseman, who was involved in an ongoing feud with the intended victim, Thomas Rhodes, who lived in Hamsworth, near Harrogate. Her culinary efforts had the desired effect, as her pastry made the entire family ill and resulted in the death of 5-year-old Joseph Rhodes. In her defence, Hannah claimed Horseman had forced her to put the poison into Rhodes' food, threatening to kill her if she refused, and that the rest of the Rhodes family were not the intended victims. Nonetheless, while Horseman faced no formal proceedings, it was Hannah who paid the penalty with her life. She was hanged at York Tyburn on the 3rd of August, 1789. 22-year-old William Smith employed an ingenious and indeed seasonal method of administering arsenic to poison not only his stepfather but his 2 half-siblings as well. William's mother had married a man called Thomas Harper, who already had 2 children of his own. William and Anne, faced with the ultimate, division and diminution of his inheritance, Smith purchased 2 pennyworth of arsenic from the local apothecary, whose suspicions he failed to arouse, as he also purchased some remedies for his horses at the same time. He allegedly had a problem with rats in the barn, as Smith decided the perfect way to administer the poison would be to mix it with the ingredients of Good Friday cake that was being prepared for the household. But unbeknownst to Smith, a maid servant had seen him interfering with the flour. The Harpers' neighbours had been invited for an Easter treat too, but clearly Providence was on their side when they were unable to make dinner, and it turned out only Tom Harper and his 2 children ended up eating any of the fatal cake. As soon as the poison began to take effect, Smith fled to Liverpool, leaving his victims to suffer in agony, till father and both children died the following day. In spite of the motives that had driven Smith's actions, he found that once on the run he was unable to live with his conscience, and returning home he was immediately arrested and confessed all. At the assizes of 1753, Smith's own confession, along with the evidence of the apothecary who had sold him the poison, and that of the maidservant who saw him tamper with the cake's ingredients, ensured he was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. On Monday the 15th of August, Smith was hanged at the York Tyburn, and afterwards his body sent for dissection. In an attempt to avert any thorough investigation of 3 kitchen deaths, Mary put it about that plague had been the cause of their demise. During the 1780s, extensive building of back-to-back housing in Quarry Hill led to frequent outbreaks of typhoid, typhus, fever, and other diseases, thanks to the overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions. Bubonic plague has made repeated appearances in Leeds through centuries, and though the last severe outbreak had occurred as long ago as 1645 when the disease struck in Vicar Lane, it had spread so quickly through the town that, between March and December of that year, over 1,300 people died. The collective memory of the deaths of over 1/5 of the estimated 6,000 strong population of Leeds in the mid-17th century was still keen, and by her inference of plague, and Mary thereby ensured that there would be no unwanted inquiries, as the lasting fear of infection meant that nobody in the neighbourhood would venture near the kitchen home or shop premises, the doors of which were prudently closed and padlocked. Mary's nerves must have been tested, however, by the visiting doctor who attended the last surviving kitchen sister on a deathbed. He was of the strong opinion that the sickness and sudden death bore the hallmarks of poisoning, and, on examining many of the vessels and cooking utensils in the house, his suspicions were clearly aroused as he asked whether any water for poisoning flies had been used, a reasonable sort of supposition as at this time, because there would be many flies and stuff. Manufacturers included arsenic in those flypapers that were hung up. A typical flypaper contained 150 to 400 milligrams of soluble arsenic salts, and was consequently the source of potential lethal dose, provided it could be administered within the area needed and not arouse suspicion. By soaking such a flypaper in water, a would-be poisoner could extract most of the soluble arsenites within a few hours, obtaining a tea-coloured solution which could then be disguised in a cup of strong tea or coffee, or a glass of brandy. However, the dilutions of arsenic obtained from flypapers were also innocently employed by some women to enhance their looks in a homemade face wash, as would be highlighted in the 1889 murder trial of Florence Maybrick, accused of poisoning her husband, who, where she came to give evidence in defence, claimed the arsenic she had extracted from the flypapers was purely for cosmetic use. This turn of events must have alarmed Mary, as the attending doctor also wanted to open the body to perform an autopsy on the kitchen sister that died. It would be wrong to assume that the standards of forensic investigation practiced by the medical fraternity at this time were crude, or to suggest that the surgeons were not competent in the conduct of autopsies. In 1752, matters had been improved for the advancement of anatomical study. In the areas of England and the Act that was passed in England, it allowed judges to substitute dissection instead of a sentence of hanging in a metal cage at the gibbet after execution, and we shall see in circumstances that it most pertinent to the story of Mary Bateman. However, as no family member was left alive to give their consent to the procedure, the body was buried without any investigation, and Mary thus avoided detection. The last of the kitchen was laid to rest in the same grave as a sister and a mother, presumably in the 17th century Quaker burial ground attached to the Friends Meeting House, known as Camp Hill Court, between Water Lane and Great Wilson Street. Some time after the funeral, the creditors were called in to assess the estate of the kitchen sisters. Though their draper's shop was known to be an entirely solvent business, it was found that both house and shop were all but empty of goods and chattels, and the account books were also missing. Clearly Mary had used the convenient closure of both premises, due to plague, as a cover under which to strip both houses and shop behind closed doors, to the extent that, when all claims on the estate had been adjudicated, the meagre belongings left met only 8 pence in the pound for each creditor's total claim. Obviously, Mary had hit her stride as a poisoner. Unencumbered she was. She did it very sneakily, didn't she? And did it well. She was unencumbered by any moral restraint in the guise of caring nurse or a well-meaning practitioner. Mary was skilled at presenting a persona of benevolent, masking her true intention. Killing someone with poison, and by its very nature, requires careful planning and subterfuge, so it comes as no surprise that, obviously, poisoners tend to be cunning, sneaky and creative, and reliant on verbal and emotional manipulation, all attributes which could be applied to Mary in spades. As far as her motives for murder we're concerned, they may have been driven by greed, and the very real need to conceal her guilt, common factors influencing many other murders, past and present, not counting those of her victims who must have earlier succumbed to her various remedies and abortifacients. In the past, she had been forced to resort to repayment to avoid prosecution for theft and extortion. Mary now availed herself of the advantage of using poison to silence her victims, and as long as she evaded detection, the feelings of power and control she experienced as a result of her success over those whose expectations she had raised, and upon those whose fears she had played, while all the time draining their purses, must have increased her confidence in the future endeavours. Even so, following the deaths of the Kitchen family, presumably as a precautionary measure, Mary must have persuaded her husband that it would be prudent to quit March Lane. It was time to move again, and for Mary to manufacture her most audacious and public exploit yet, and one of sacrilegious nature. And that is the next part of Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire Witch. As you can see, this is why she is named a witch, because she poisoned people. But really, she's just a criminal, basically. That's all she is. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to join me for the next part. Many blessings.